Today is August 14th, 2026. My name is Charles Suter. Today I'm presenting part 3 of the Art of Compromise, and with a focus on how to quantify the preference of each party. In other words, each party can claim that something is important, but how do you quantify how important is the need for that particular outcome? This presentation is going to explain how to assess each person's preferences for each particular outcome on a particular disagreement. My main message, a multi-issue disagreement, which is what we're going to be discussing today. In the previous past, we've talked about the single-issue disagreement, and it's going to be resolved by maximizing the preferences of all parties. Now, multi-issue disagreements are less common form of interpersonal conflict, but they're more difficult to resolve. Doesn't matter, disagreements over important issues, if not resolved, can elevate into conflict if the parties can't find to resolve them in a fair and timely manner. To resolve any issue or sets of issues, one way to proceed is to break down each issue into separate elements, if they're divisible, and most times they are if the parties make a creative effort to do so. The separate elements of an issue don't need to be of equal value. With multiple issues or sub-issue elements, the divisible pieces can be divided amongst the parties based upon relative importance. Ideally, the division is in proportion to their relative importance or preferences to each party, and if one element of the disagreement is more important to one party or the other, ideally, that element should be allocated to them. For this method to work, each party's preferences must be quantified, and that's the purpose of this presentation. It's a methodology for quantifying each party's preference for a sub-issue within the disagreement to ease the allocation of the parts. Now, the next presentation will be how to discuss and allocate the elements of the parties once their preferences are known. Again, the purpose of this presentation is simply to quantify each party's preferences. And so we have step number 1. We have an issue where there are two issues, and each issue is decomposed into 2 sub-issues, as shown here below. Issue A and B, and sub-elements 1 and 2. So we have A1, A2, B1, B2. These elements here are going to be divided amongst the 2 parties based upon their relative preference. First step is for each party to prioritize importance from lowest to highest, each of these 4 elements. So this is for person or party number 1. They've ranked B2 the least important, A1 the next important, A2 the next, and B1 as the most important. Let's go on to step number 2. In order to then determine their relative importance, we have to have some measure of their relative importance, and this is the scale that does that. We're going to compare pairwise each element in turn, moving from bottom to top. We're going to compare A1 to B2, A2 to A1, and B1 to A2. And we're going to find out how much more important is A1 to B2. To begin with, we give B2, or the lowest ranked element, a reference value of 1. And then we go to the scale up here and we determine how much more important is A1 to B2. Is it equal? If it is, put a 1. Slightly more important, put a 1.5. Moderately important, a 2. Significantly important, a 3. Dominantly more important, you would put a 5. Now, this particular party rates A1 to be slightly more important than B2, so that gets a 1.5. However, between A2 and A1, this party says they're roughly equal. So when they're equal, rate of 1. However, B1 is twice as important as A2. So now we have the relative values pairwise 2, 1, 1.5, and 1. let's go on to the next step. This is where we are right now. We have the relative values, but we don't have the weighted value. We're going to calculate the weighted value as follows. B1 always retains the reference value of 1, and the relative value for 2 is now its relative weight times 1, which is 1.5. A2 gets its value by multiplying 1 times this value. Since they're equal, each of these A2 and A1 receive a weighted value of 1.5. However, B1 is twice as valuable or important as 1.5, so it gets a reference weighted value of 3. Now, where do we go from here? Well, if we add up all the preference scores, you get a 7. And we want to make sure that each party receives the same amount of consideration. We want their allocations of weights of importance to be added up to 100%. And a way to do that is to divide each of these reference numbers by the total. So 3 divided by 7 is 43% of the total. 1.5 divided by 7 is roughly 21.5. Same thing for the one below it, A1. Notice that I've given the A2 a slightly higher score simply because it's rated higher, even though they're both judged to be relatively equal. And lastly, the least important, 1 divided by 7 is 14. The total is 100%. Now, here's what we can conclude. We can conclude that according to this party, B1 is most important and B2 is least important. So there's a good chance that this party will get allocated their preference on B1. Now, depending upon which of the other 3 that they're allocated depends upon which of the relative values the other party has. We'll deal with that in the next presentation. But you may be wondering, in what circumstances might you apply this? Well, consider the division of a deceased person's personal possessions amongst the heirs. How do you allocate when everyone says, oh, that's all important to me? Oh, that's important to me as well. Well, one way to do that is to put a quantify their relative importance, and this is one method to do it. How about the division of household chores or responsibilities amongst family members? How about the allocation of discretionary spending and savings? Child rearing tasks, priority of home repairs. The list could very well be could be endless. But anyway, this prioritization and weighting process has many other uses besides just settling disagreements. And once you learn the method, you will find many uses for it in your work, family, and personal life. So remember, the next presentation, we'll learn how to apply these priorities of each of the stakeholders or parties into allocating and settling the disagreement. So that's all for now. Remember to stay positive, you'll be happier and healthier and live longer.